So the next thing we want to do is start entering the field names for our table. There are a few guidelines that we need to keep in mind when creating fields within our table. Firstly, our field names can start with any letter at all. They do not have to begin with a Z or a Y like our table names themselves. The field names can have a maximum of 16 characters. Our tables must have at least one key field. This is used later on for searching and sorting of data, and they identify each record as being a unique record. You can assign an initial value to a field. Let's say in our example, we add an employee class. Let's say the majority of our employees are going to be regular staff. So let's say we have an initial value of S for staff, but we do have some employees that are directors. Maybe they have a code of D. So we can say our initial value would always be an S, but allow the user to change the value to a D later on. Every field that we use in our table is made up of what we call a data element. And the data element defines specific attributes of each field. One word of warning here, data elements must adhere to the customer namespace again. So they must, for anything new that we create, begin with the letter Z or Y. So let's start off with entering our first field. And the field we're going to create is a very important field within an SAP system. It's the field that identifies the client that our records are associated with. So in the field name, enter client. And the data element, we will enter MANDT. Now the data element already exists in the system. And when I press enter after entering it, you can see the system automatically filled in the data type, the length, number of decimals, short text for the actual data element itself. Now, very important, we need to ensure that the client field is made a key field within our table. The next field we're going to enter is going to be our own created field. And this is going to be employee. Again, we're going to make this field a key field. And we're going to use a brand new data element called ZEENUM. Once you have done this, click the Save button. I always like to save the table as we go along. Now the next thing is ZEENUM does not exist, so we have to create the data element. So even though it's let us enter it here, if we try to activate the table or just check the table, we should see an error message, and we do. So basically, because we haven't got a data element called ZEENUM already existing in the system, it's telling us we cannot activate this table and use it within our system. So press F3 or the back button. And then we're going to use forward navigation to create the data element. Another way of doing it is to open up a brand new session. Go to SE11 again. And start creating the individual objects this way. But we don't want to do that. We want to use forward navigation. And we do this just by double-clicking our brand new data element. So we get this window that appears called Create Data Elements. And it's telling us the element does not exist. Do we want to create it? Answer yes. Then we get taken to the Maintain Data Element window. Similar to the first screen that we saw when we created our table, the data element window is asking us for some short text. So let's enter in here employee data element. Under the short text, you can see 4 tabs, and the one that's highlighted says data type. We can see here the elementary data type, called the domain, needs to be defined for our data element. Now this is important. Domains must adhere to the customer namespace. And we are going to create a brand new domain using the same name that we use for the data element. Now don't get confused. This doesn't mean there's some sort of magical relationship between the names. There isn't. We're just using the same name because that's what I've decided. So enter ZEENUM, and once again we're going to use forward navigation to create the domain. So double click the entry. It's telling us our data element has changed, and do we want to save it before creating our domain? Choose yes. We get the Create Object Directory entry window appearing again, and just as before, we want to save this development to the $temp development class. So you can either just click the Save button or just click the Local Object button. So now, because we've used forward navigation, it's telling us that the new domain we are trying to create does not exist. Choose Yes to create the domain. And once again, enter some short text that describes what the domain is going to be used for. So we will just enter employee domain. Under the short text, we can see 3 tabs, and the one that's highlighted says Definitions. The fields available to us, the first one says Data Type. Click the drop down on Data Type. You will see lots of generic data types already exist within the ABAP dictionary, and we can use one of these for our employee field or domain. We're going to choose numC, which is a character string with only digits. So double click the entry, and that fills in the data type field for us. In the number of characters, enter 8, which means this field is going to contain a maximum of 8 characters. And we want zeros for decimals, which is the default anyway for a numC field. Select an output length of 8, and just hit the Enter key. We can see here that where we have entered the numC, it has brought back the description of this field, which tells us it's a valid entry. And the next thing we want to do is just take a quick peek at the Value Range tab. Now this tab is all about setting valid value ranges for the domain that you are creating. If you set a value range and a user enters a value in a field outside the valid value range that you set up, they will be shown an error message and be requested to enter a valid entry. Now there are 3 options for the value range. The first we can see says single values, and this is where you actually enter a list of individual valid values that a user can enter. The next is intervals. So if you have quite a lot of values, but they're all related or all in a sequence, you can enter the lower limit and upper limit. For example, a lower limit of 1, an upper limit of 9. And that saves you entering 9 individual single values. A user can only enter a value that falls within the ranges that you specify. The last option you have is Value Table. When you have a large number of possible entries, it's quite common to use a value table instead of a value range or list of single values. With a value table, you specify a complete valid value table entry list. But please note that if you use this option, you must also introduce foreign keys to your table to ensure the user's entries are tested against the values stored in the value table that you create. We don't need to enter any value ranges for this domain, so all we need to do is click the Save button. Once again, we are presented with the Object Directory Entry pop-up box, and we want to assign this object as a local object. So click the Local Object button. Now the next thing we want to do is activate this object. Even though we have saved it, it doesn't mean we can actively use it within our table yet. We need to set the object as active, which means our other data elements can actually use this domain going forward. So on the toolbar, you'll see a little matchstick icon. If you hover over, it says Activate. And you can also press the Ctrl and F3 key. Click the Activate button, and then you're presented with a pop-up box which lists 3 different objects that are currently inactive. You can, if you wish, try and activate all the objects together, but I strongly advise you do not do this. When you are working in a typical development environment, you have got a number of other people creating developments all the time, and it's quite often you will see their objects appearing in this list, or maybe you've got a number of development projects on the go for yourself, and you could see inactive objects that you've created yourself in other projects that you don't want to activate just yet. So for now, we only want to activate the domain. So our top entry, object type DOMA, we can see ZEENUM. It is highlighted at the moment, so all we need to do is click the green tick. The system goes away, checks all the entries we have made for the domain itself, and if everything is okay, it will then activate the object. And if you look at the status bar at the bottom of the screen, everything's okay, so we can now proceed on with creating our table. Now remember, we used forward navigation for generating our domain. So all we need to do is step back. So click the F3 key, and you are taken back to your data element maintenance screen. Now because we have created and activated our domain, we can now see the text for our domain has actually come through and been placed beside the ZEENUM entry that we entered before. And it has brought back the individual domain properties that we created. Now the next thing we need to do is define the field labels. So click on the Field Labels tab, and here we need to define the short, medium, long and heading field labels for our data element. Now a little shortcut here, we've already entered the short text, so if you highlight that and use your Ctrl-C key to copy the entry to the clipboard, then you can come down to each individual field label and just paste it in one at a time. Now we can see for the short field name, our employee data element does not fit into the field label, so then just go ahead and tailor it so it all makes sense. Now remember, the field labels that we enter here are going to appear as field labels on our table. So we don't actually want it to say data element. We just want it to say employee or employee number. So in this case, I'm going to choose employee N, employee number, and copy that to the remaining field labels. Now you'll see on the left hand side there's a length field which I have on purpose not filled in, because once you put the entries in the field label, then press the enter key, it will automatically calculate the length of the entries that you have typed in. Once this is complete, save the data element and then activate it. Again, we get a window showing the inactive objects. This time we're only left with 2 objects. And remember, we only want to activate the object we are working on right now. So highlighted, we can see object type DTEL, which is the data element. So just click the tick button. And if everything works out okay, the status bar at the bottom of your screen will show objects activated. Now again, we used forward navigation from our table to create our domain. So all we need to do is press the F3 key or press the back button, and we step back to our table maintenance screen. And you can see right now the employee field that we were creating and the data element entry that we keyed in has got the appropriate data type, length, decimals, and short text brought back into our grid to indicate everything is working okay. Now we have just gone through the sequence of creating a data element and domain that we then use for our field. We are going to use the exact same practice for creating 4 additional fields.